All set to start. This is going to be a rather short, probably, though it never turns out that way, and boring kind of talk, because there's not going to be a lot of spiritual excitement tonight because it takes reintroduction. And even though I spent a lot of time studying over the break, I still don't have enough notes ready, so we're going to go as far as I can go. This is the third year that we've been talking about myths. And the purpose of the talks for this year and the probably next year, before I get done with the idea, is to understand hierarchies of consciousness. That is, to understand what is more important and what is less important, because all things are not equal. The whole universe changes and continues to change because of inequality. And so what we're doing is we're beginning anyway with myths. And by looking at the different ways different societies were able to view God and the gods, all of the creative hierarchies in what they did, we're hoping to understand some of the basic principles of hierarchy. In this, we're following the ideas of the mystery schools. And the mystery schools have one primary principle, which we'll come into several times in the next few weeks. And that is called the Hermetic axiom, which actually originated in Egypt, and it reads, "As above, so below, what has gone before in heaven will follow after on earth. Know this and rejoice." That's the way it was about a 4th century alchemist in the Roman Empire wrote it that way. I don't know his name. But it's the principle of analogy. It's like the Bible saying, we are made in the image of God. And since God is a spirit, we are spiritual images of God. And what happens in the macrocosm happens in the microcosm. And therefore, if we can understand the hierarchies of angels and archangels and things like that, and the function that they have within the evolutionary creation of the divine, then we can understand the similar things that are in our own being, and that we can live lives that are more harmonious with the whole creation that we're in and our part in it. So that's what the whole business is about, and we're going to have a lot of, it's going to be very circuitous, and we're going to take a lot of side trips. In this, we're assuming that mythology is not just a bunch of stories that were made up by ancient people that had nothing to do but sit around the campfire. We're saying that the stories that are in the myths are that mythology itself is a universal language of the spirit, which is why there are so many, many, many interpretations of the same myth, because the truth is universal, and the more deeply you understand the spiritual truth, the more different sides you can see to it. It's only human beings that have a device that does one thing. The divine does many things with one stroke. And so the stories represent, you might say, the character, which is the flavor of the divine. And so different gods represent different things within the character of God, the macrocosm. We won't be doing much of it tonight because we are reintroducing and trying to focus on what we're trying to do. But mostly we're going to tell a lot of stories and then look at those stories to get at spiritual principles, and especially the principle of hierarchy. Another thing we're trying to do is we're at a period where no new myths are really being created. And there's a reason for that, and that comes from about a, oh boy, what is it, Jakob Bema, 14th or 15th century? I don't know. Jakob Bema was an illiterate shoemaker who spent a lot of his time praying and contemplating.
I thought it was Jacob Bohm, so
yeah,
that's why I didn't recognize the name.
Yeah, it's Jakob Bema.
Yeah. Okay.
I
knew him well. I did know him well. I just didn't remember his name. I didn't pronounce his name that way.
And he spent a lot of time praying while he was making shoes, at least according to the tradition. And one day, a very enlightened being came into the door of his shop, and he pointed at him and said, Jakob Bema, you are going to write great books. And what was happening was, because of the character of his life and because of the integrity of his being, he was culturing his soul nature. And that great spiritual being, from that moment on, helped him to open up seership inside of himself. And then he not only had to deal with the huge problem of rationally understanding what you get when you develop seership, but he had to learn to read and write in order to share it. And he studied a lot of Paracelsus, and he studied a lot of the Bible. And this is what he said about the Bible. He knew it almost by heart, both the Old and the New Testament. And he says, now is the time to give up the Bible. Because now is the time for all of us to see the spiritual reality straightforward. And as long as we depend on symbols, we're never going to see them straightforward, because a symbol is always something that's in between you and the spiritual reality. And his basic thesis was, if an illiterate shoemaker like me can come to direct experience, direct knowledge, so can anyone else. So what we're trying to do is, on the basis of the mysteries and the way we understand the mysteries in ourselves, we're trying to digest the ancient myths and bring them to life as soul material for understanding and living right now. It's sort of like plants. After a plant has lived its life, it is broken down and it is used as fertilizer in order to have better plant growth in the future. If you don't have humus, it's very hard to have fertile soil. And so the idea is that the ancient myths, which are sort of like a burden on our back, the more we can dissolve them and bring them into modern, direct, straightforward spiritual consciousness with no symbols, the better off we are, the more helpful it is to our whole activity. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a lot of mythical symbols then and try to digest them. To do this, we began with Hindu mythology, because it is one of the more ancient and one of the more accessible. And I had a reason, because I wanted to deal with chaos, and Hindu mythology has a lot of chaos in it. When we did that, we tried to understand consciousness itself, the spirit of spirits, or the basic essence of everything that is, the One. When we did that, we noted that the Hindus broke everything into attributes, universal attributes, and they used the principle of triangulation to understand the whole of the spirit by the part that could be objectified with the simplest number of lines of consciousness, the triangle. And therefore we talked about the principle of Trinity, which was common to all schools of spiritual thought that developed straight from seership. And when we're talking about seership, we're not talking about clairvoyance. We're talking about spiritual vision. Clairvoyance is when one has a sensitivity to various levels of the etheric world or the desire world, and one sees all of these forms and all of these beings, but that is just seeing the form. Then there are people who have insight, intuitive insight, and they transcendentally, in the spirit, understand the meaning of things. But a seer who has spiritual vision is one who has the sensitivity to see the things in the various worlds and the intuition to understand what they mean. And this is where the mysteries were developed. It was developed by people who had, with great labor, sensitized themselves, and with even greater labor, began to understand and objectively test what they saw with their seership and what they intuitively felt to be the truth. Because even if they intuitively had the insight to know the truth, they still followed the admonition that is given in the Bible, try all things, or try all spirits, in that they did. And they came to the conclusion that the basic nature of oneness in consciousness is triune. And we talked most of the first half of last semester about the three attributes of spiritual being, whether you see it in the human being or whether you see it in the supreme being, which is as deep and as high as one can go in creation. Okay, that's what we did. And when we looked at all of the many, many gods, because they saw each, unlike the Hebrews, who saw three beings who were representative, called the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, or Jehovah. The Hebrews saw these as representative of the attributes. What the Hindus did is they made them each be a divinity in themselves, which they really are, but they didn't clarify things. So you had Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiv. Okay. And because they did not differentiate, except in sectarian schools, each of which had their own god be the most powerful, because they were attuned to that one and not to the others. And, insecure people very often, like little kids that are insecure, say, my dad can beat up your dad, or my big brother can beat up your big brother. And a lot of people do that. You see it all the time. There are a lot of conversations that take place here in the bookstores. My teacher is better than your teacher, is more powerful spiritually than your teacher. That sort of stuff comes out. You see it all the time. But we looked at many, many divinities and saw what they represented. And we saw that the difficulty with Hinduism as it became developed was that it had no hierarchy. That everybody accepted all of the gods, and at least the exoteric form of the myths came to be that one thing was not more important to another, And the consequence of that was chaos. And we talked about two different kinds of chaos, which I don't want to go into now because it would be a very big distraction from where we're trying to get tonight. And the result in that chaos is that the lowest things and the highest things were of equal value. And spirit and matter were also of equal value, and in that kind of confusion, then the grossest kinds of materialism could take place side by side with the deepest kind of spirituality, and then you had idolatry, where people actually thought idols not only represented the divine, but that the divine actually lived in those idols and was those idols in a very strange sort of way. And so you had a collapse into chaos, and in that collapse into chaos there was a lack of hierarchy, and the consequence was idolatry. All right, that's some of the things that came out of it, because I don't want to put down Hindu mythology, because we saw some very, very holy principles in there, and in fact that's what we occupied ourselves with most of the semester. So now we're going to be turning to Egyptian mythology, and we're going to leave off from the Hindus in a little bit more to say about them yet, and turn to the Egyptians and see how they saw hierarchy and the consequences of it in their society, in their religion, and in the unfoldment of people. Very, very interesting topic. But what we're going to be looking at is very different than the Hindu mythology, because the Hindu mythology is unique. It's almost singular in that it is the only living mythology on the surface of the earth right now. That is to say that the ancient myths and scriptures are still the basis for a religion. Not necessarily just a scripture telling you to live this way or that way, but the stories, the mythical stories themselves, form the basis of a religion. And no, that doesn't happen anywhere else. Other people talk about direct revelations, and they sometimes revert to symbols, but this is the only case where mythology is still alive. That doesn't mean that there are new stories being told, but there are new commentaries. I get catalogs, and there are all kinds of commentaries that are still being developed out of the same ancient stories. And in a way, you might say what we did last semester was a continuation of that kind of activity. So there is a lot of commentary and a lot of speculation on it. Now this has something beneficial and something very detrimental about it. The advantage is there is a great security in the continuity of the development that is still alive. There is a continuous living expression or impulse of spirit that carries right to our times. But because it's been so long since the origin of the Hindu myths, it's sort of like tracing back a conversation. You say, how did we get to what we're talking about? And it's a really hard thing to say, oh, this person brought this in, and they were commenting on this, and sometimes something wanders very, very far from its origins, and that's often what it's like to understand what modern Hinduism is relative to the ancient stories. It's sort of like tracing back a very, very long conversation. It's detrimental because there is an increasing detritus that builds up around the ancient stories. There's more and more awful, and there are more and more mistakes and obscurities and things like that. So it becomes a very, very stagnant dogma. It's very hard to change something that's that big and that cumbersome. And so it's filled with numerous archaic beliefs or things that worked at one time but don't work now, or if they do work now, they're dangerous. And it's too vast to live in the appropriateness of it now without having to know everything that came before. This is composition of music. Classical music has gotten into the same place that Hindu mythology is in. That in order to be a classical music composer, you have to demonstrate to other composers that you know all of this theory and that you know all of these thematic evolutions and how music has come to be. And before you can even write a note on the sheet, music has always been developed by people who are renegades. Beethoven was a terrible renegade. Wagner was a renegade. All of these people were renegades because they didn't do that. It becomes so scholastified that, I don't know if that's probably a word again that's made up, but Daniel is smiling at me these days instead of frowning. And he says, all right, let him make up words if he wants to. I know the truth. But you get the idea that I'm trying to get at. And it also becomes sort of an illusion or a distraction. You get stuck on thinking this is the only way things can be done. I've never worked at a place yet where a new person comes on the job, and even if they're not skilled, they improve things because they can see where you're stuck in the old ways and things need renewal and they need to be changed. And that's the big problem with things like when you have a continuous living religion from a mythology like Hinduism. To a large extent, it is as bad to have a backlog of good karma as it is to have a backlog of bad karma, because anything that's undigested that keeps your attention on it because you've got to take care of it. It's nice if you could digest it all and live right now in the moment and meet the future and meet it creatively rather than carrying a backlog of ugly hang-ups and too many talents that are impediments to new things. And so the Hindu religion is much like that. So we're going to try and be like Jakob Behmers and look at things in a more modern way. Now, we're ready to begin talking about Egyptian mythology. Well, it's going to take 2 weeks of introduction to get at where we want to get at. We won't even have many stories tonight. We'll throw a few little things in of interest. Egyptian mythology is almost the opposite of Hindu mythology because it is about the deadest of the dead. If there is anything as a relative death, the Egyptians among major mythologies have it. If you can be more dead than another thing. In the first place, the language is dead. No one is even certain that they have any idea of how the Egyptian language was pronounced. A lot lives in the language. To get the spirit, I don't know how to say it. Seers claim that races and cultures and sometimes even families and clans have tutelary spirits that guide them. And they bring the people that are incarnated in those clans or in those races or in those very close cultures. They bring the incarnated beings in those cultures to certain kinds of experiences. And each of those cultures is an implement. Something like if you're making a garden, first you use a spade to turn the soil over, and you use another tool to break it up, you use another tool to break it up even finer, you use another device to plant the seeds, and another one to hoe, and then another one eventually to harvest. And each of the different cultures or societies represents a different kind of tool. And the tutelary spirits, which are usually archangels, the Bible talks literally about it, talks about the archangel of Greece, is talking to David, and he says, I'm going to bring them to war against this other society so I can smash them down because they need to learn this kind of lesson. It's pretty low kind of talk, but it has a great value to it. It's quite literal. But these archangels use various different cultural tools to bring the experiences that people need. Among them are the most personal things, foods. Like only, just think of sauerkraut and sauerbraten and all of those very German things versus a rice-eating society, or like all the societies that like hot food versus all the societies that like cold food. Clothing. Just think if you lived your whole life wearing a toga rather than wearing chainmail, tight-fitting armor. Or language. Just think if you had a deep guttural language or a language that was very accentuated in consonants, your experience of reality would be very different by the food you ate, because the food has spiritual properties in it from the very spirits that guide the plants. And so the language and clothing and all of those things are this is a side trip I didn't intend to take, but I got plenty of time tonight so that I can go on side trips because I don't have a lot of notes ready. So we're very much at a disadvantage in not knowing the spoken language of the Egyptians, and we can only guess because we can't feel what the words sounded like. And what's even more difficult is everything in Egyptian mythology, even in the hieratic stages of Egyptian mythology, is derived from things that come from hieroglyphs. And nobody knows what those hieroglyphs mean for certain. There's a lot of guessing. In some cases, I think there's very good intuitions on the part of Egyptologists. And in some cases, I think a lot of people who were incarnated in Egyptian bodies were so stuck on the culture that they were reborn as Egyptologists so that they could glorify Egypt all over again. It's very, very difficult when something is presented to you in a pictogram versus when it is given to you in language. Because when you read language, you hear in your ear or in your mind the words. When you look at a pictogram, you're using a much different sense. You're using the visual sense, and the way you understand reality with the visual sense is very different than the way you understand reality with the ear. I happen to favor the ear myself, but I'm a little bit closed-minded, and that's why I have hearing difficulties at these days. Try as I might to be open, I sometimes get a little closed. But because I haven't developed vision correctly, I've been a sucker for pretty faces when I should have listened to the tone of their voice and the words that they said. I would have been much, much better off, because what you see with the eye and the way you understand reality with the eye is very different than when you listen with the ear. And so we not only have a language that we don't know how it was pronounced, the only representation of it is visual. And because a picture is worth 1,000 words, people who are visionary or very visual are often subject to illusion. Because when you see an object with your eyes, you think you understand the meaning of it. And people who are extremely visual are assuming people and take for granted. Whereas people who listen often listen for a hidden inner meaning that isn't on the surface. Because language is something that in order to work with things that you hear, you must always interpret it, or you must always make it your own, and you can't assume that you know it. Now, I'm not saying that everybody who's visual is like that, because clearly a lot of painters and a lot of artists do a lot of creative interpreting and a lot of creative expression, so that when you look at visual art, you can't just take it at face value and say, I like this or I don't like this. You have to look with an inner eye, and you have to let it sink in as much as things that you hear. All right. So those are some of the problems involved with Egypt. There are many more. And that is, even in ancient times, even as late as 300 AD, 400 AD, the Egyptian religion was still practiced, but it was still very, very closed. Many people, Persians, Romans, conquered the Egyptians and were influenced by the Egyptians, but the Egyptians never, ever gave up their own religion in favor of the religion of the conquerors. They were so set on the truth of their religion that they didn't care who ruled them or what. They understood what the truth was. Now we're going to try and see how this kind of consciousness, this very closed consciousness, is a consequence of the hierarchical understanding that the Egyptians had. On the other hand, they did have a little influence on other people. It's very clear that even a lot of the names in the Hebrew Kabbalah and the Kabbalistic works and even the tarot cards, you can trace more anciently and antecedently to Egypt. That because of the monotheism, the very peculiar kind of monotheism of the Jews, they became so singular that they had no horizontals to their hierarchy. And therefore they had to be taken over by other people so that they could bring in culture to their society. I don't know how to say it any other way. Like all of the numbers that are the numerology and the numerical ideas that is within Judaism comes from the Chaldeans, from the Chaldean book of Numbers. You can trace it back further in time to Chaldea than you can to the Hebrews. And the Egyptians, in the same way, had a strong influence on the Jews in that they gave a lot of their mythology, a lot of their names Set for Seth, and we'll run into many along the way, so that Hebrews expropriated a lot of things, like the Enochian philosophy was basically a Greek philosophy, so the Hebrews borrowed a lot from the Greeks. I don't want to get on that subject as a thing, but nonetheless, the Egyptian outlook was not carried by any other society. There were influences in Greece and Rome, like Plato took initiations and unfolded some of his seership more deeply in Egypt. After he had been through the lesser Eleusinian mysteries, he went to Egypt and was initiated there. Lucius, or Lucian, of Apuleius, who wrote the Golden Ass of Apuleius, clearly writes about the initiations into the myths of Isis and Osiris and his experience of that. But Egyptian religion was never practiced, really, even in the later days of the Roman Empire, when they took on Mithraism and Mandeanism and things like that. They never took on Egyptian religion. So Egyptian religion is really, really dead. All right. And then another thing that makes Egyptian, this is all a big cop-out. I'm trying to introduce you to Egypt. It's a big cop-out to saying that in many ways Egyptian mythology is unfathomable to me. And so I'm giving a big cover-up why I can't.
Let's see, is that cop-out? Is that like cop?
Yeah, like Coptic. Yeah, Coptic out, yeah. A latter sect where what he's talking about is there's a form of Gnosticism called Coptic Gnosticism around the Gospel of St. Thomas is one of the later Boutros Boutros-Ghali, the Secretary General of the United Nations, is a Copt. And Coptic Christianity is different than any other form of Christianity because it's the only form of Gnosticism that still exists as Gnosticism. And it is a form of Christianity that took a lot of it's probably the best facsimile that we have of Egyptian views at all, especially the Egyptian conception of resurrection. Because of the resurrection of Osiris and the daily resurrection of Ra, that the Coptic Gnosticism still is like that. So, but nonetheless, it's still very hard to get at the ancient Egyptian religion. Another reason for this is that the Egyptians were very material and objective people. And the religion itself, more than any other religion you'll ever find anywhere, is focused on the dead. All of their ceremonies, even to them, even gods died, which is an interesting question that we'll come up to much later. But a lot of their religion was trying to resurrect dead gods, and a lot of their religion was trying to find favor through the dead, and a lot of their religion was strengthening their character so that they would have more of an advantage when they died. And their whole conception of death was just like a continuation of this life. Or almost like people who believe that, who take the Bible literally and say that when you die you're going to have a harp and you're going to sit on a cloud and all of that sort of thing. They were even much more literal than that. They thought they were going to eat honey cakes and all the little pleasantries, all the little pleasantries of material life, they thought were going to carry over into the inner worlds. And so what they did almost like science fiction does. They took this world and the present in this world and they just extrapolated into the inner worlds. The character of the Egyptian religion did not lend itself well to the suppleness of spiritual life and a continuing evolution. The religion, more than mystical, was occult. And not occult to find hidden meanings, but occult to practice. There was no such thing as a theoretical part of Egyptian religion, at least as it's written down in the many recensions that are extant to this day. It was all magical. You didn't go to church and commune with the Spirit in other people to be edified and to come closer to God. You practiced magical words. You drew magical pictures, and they had to be exact. And the words had to be intonated right in so many times and in so many ways, so that you would have a magical advantage. We'll get into some of the whys, why this took place in a historical sense in just a moment. But the consequence is that this is a struggle that carries like right into Christianity. Like if you read in the Bible, there was a struggle between those who thought that faith in Christ was enough, and others who thought that one earned salvation by deeds. These are really the mystical side and the occult side. The mystical side does everything by faith and by an ultimate belief and surrender to God, everything is accomplished. The other side believes that by carrying out the laws of God and by being able to function and use the powers that are given to you is the way you develop. You develop by your own effort and by your own work. Anyone who practices either side to extreme is in great peril. I lost a friend to alcoholism just a little over a year ago because he was an occultist to the exclusion of mystical surrender. He tried to master everything. He tried to master a car so that he could bring it around the corner at the utmost speed without flipping out. But then he always had, flipping the car over, but then he always had the pride in his achievement and tried to do a little more. And he eventually flipped the cars over and ruined a number of them. But he prided himself in mastery. And he was so bent on that pole of existence that he had great problems. I don't even want to talk about all of his problems. But they were any kind of substance that could be abused, just about he abused. I think from the age 10 to when he died at 37, I don't think he ever had more than a sober month. And for him to have a sober 3 days in a row was something unusual. And he couldn't go to Alcoholics Anonymous because they didn't know the spiritual truths, which meant he couldn't surrender. And he represents something like the quality of the Egyptians. There was no surrender. It was all magical. And when you get involved with magic, it stands to reason. If you surrender yourself to the divine, you transcend. What is the big word that the mystic always has? You'll let go. Or like the people at the Alcoholics Anonymous say it, let go and let God. On the other hand, if you are an occultist, you're doing works, which means you are altering things. You are metamorphizing the stuff of reality, which is an important part of an evolutionary creation, because evolution changes and goes on. And because the Egyptians were so involved with magical transformations and magical control of things, they were focused on things. And the consequence of an unbalanced society or an unbalanced individual that gets involved with the magical side of things is materialism, a dead kind of materialism. And that's one of the things that skewed all of the Egypt and makes it very hard for us to understand right now. It was also a very, very rigid culture. And it never let go of anything, especially ancient things. And this is another thing, it's another illusion. We're afraid to let go of what we know. Krishnamurti was a very wise man when he says, we're not afraid of the unknown. We're afraid of losing the known, because we have developed our identity and our awakening self-conscious by coming to know what we know. And if what we know happens to be true, because in the ancient world, the Egyptians were clearly accepted as scientifically the wisest of all people. Like when Xerxes had subjugated Egypt, because Egyptians were never warring people. They got overcome by a lot of people, and the Persian conquest of them was, they were part of the Persian kingdom. So when Xerxes came across the continent to overpower the Greeks, he had all these different armies with him. He had Scythian armies and all such like that. And rather than go around the peninsula, it was because there was 1 million people and over 1 million camp followers, people who provided them. They had people going back and forth hundreds and eventually thousands of miles because he had to drink only water from one river. And they constantly had riders going back and forth across the continent with water so that the king could be kept alive. But everybody else, they were given a section of land. So suppose they were going across the peninsula to save hundreds of miles going around with boats, which may be perilous. And what they did is they dug channels right across so that they could bring the whole army of millions right across the peninsula. Everybody else tried to dig channels like this. The Egyptians dug their channels like this because they knew it involved the least amount of labor. Everybody else was square-headed about things. And the Egyptians had knowledge that nobody else. Oh. And because their knowledge worked, they were afraid to let go of it. They were a very constipated society. And for this reason, there was not always a great evolution in the Egyptian religion, in the Egyptian consciousness. Because they had some very, very ancient recondite knowledge and they weren't going to let go of it. And sometimes if you say to yourself, well, I got to let go of it. It's almost like Descartes. He said, I'm going to let go of everything and try to go as fundamentally as I can on intuition. And he came out with a whole new outlook. I think we should almost do that every few years. Let go of everything and start all over and be completely fresh about it. And for that reason, it's also hard. It becomes like people who live in their own little world. They have their language, their personal, private language, so that even if you understood the formal language, you didn't know all the little idiosyncrasies. And their religion was like that too. And since it was magical, there was hierarchy right in the religion itself. Because the priests knew how to control the magic. They had the power. Because they practiced magic. They didn't have to do agriculture and things like that. They practiced magic from young on. They had a lot of other power too. They had most of the, they were in charge of all the education. And if they're the teachers and the doctors and the priests at the same time, man, that's a lot of power. Just think what the doctors have now or what the priests have now. The priests are losing it now. But, you roll them all up in one person like that they tightly control, and they're not going to let things change. However, when they did change, they changed for political reasons. There were a lot of infights among different groups in Egypt. We're going to come to that in a little while. And what they would do is they would declare the truth all over again, biased to their favor. They would tell the same old stories over again, not to give a new spiritual interpretation, as we saw in Hinduism with the Upanishads and other commentary works, the Brahmanadas and things like that. They did it for power. And the way they did it is through recensions. And a recension is when you tell the ancient, age-old story over a brand new way, and you destroy all the others. The only reason that we know anything at all that this took place is because some of the tombs, the older recensions were buried with the people, and there were such powerful magical curses that nobody would dare tear open the tear open the tombs and get rid of those recensions. That was too dangerous of a thing. And they claimed that they were divinely official recensions when they were basically political. Okay. Sure. It might break things up, but we'll...
Well, I just wondered what
Recension
recension means.
means cutting off and restating. That's the term for a restatement of the cutting off the old and restating the religion in a new mode. And it's a very official kind of statement. And I think there are like some things like the Book of the Dead. I think that there are at least about 3 or 4 recensions. But sometimes they even had parallel versions when there were 2 sets of priesthoods that were about of equal strength. They each had their own version of like a book of the underworld, for example. There are 2 books of the underworld, and they're very similar to each other, but there are very subtle differences that skew it toward one god or another god. And some of this will come much clearer when we get into the actual mythology and the way the gods were set up. Okay. Since we're looking at very unexciting things tonight and very mundane things, let's look at the origins of Egyptian culture. They are multiple. Unlike the Hindus, which claim to be of a very pure origin, coming from original sources and the original divine language, Sanskrit, the Egyptians have multiple sources. The sources of Egyptian culture are very ancient. We're not only dealing with the most dead culture or the most dead mythology, but we're dealing with, of those still on the earth, the most ancient. The official academic view is that they are at least 12,000 years old. And most Egyptologists believe that some of the things go back 14 and 16,000 years, even into pre-dynastic times. Occultists claim something else. Occultists claim that Egyptian civilization is at least 250,000 years old, and that the Great Pyramid, Cheops, was started in the middle third of the Atlantean period of time. And Atlantis was not a place as much as it was a period of time. Every reality can be looked at from the viewpoint of time and spirit, or from space and matter. And most people, when they think of Atlantis or Lemuria or things like that, they're thinking in terms of space or matter or a location in a place. The Atlantean epoch goes back millions of years, but in the as the Atlantis was the period of time after, this is going to sound very wild, but just take it and throw it away as another fairy tale if you like, after the moon was separated from the earth and the surface of the earth recrystallized, and with that separation there took place in the inner consciousness of human beings a stratification of the aura, the desire nature, such that the lower self could be inculcated into the desire body. That marked the beginning of Atlantis. The physical nature of the earth was that the water vapor, some of which was still trapped inside of the earth. In fact, some people believe that quite a bit of it is still there, that from when the fireball formed inside of the solar cosmos, that ball that cooled down and became the earth, that a lot of the water was trapped inside. In Atlantean times it still was, and the water that was out was vaporous. And we lived under the fog. We had gill sacks and such like that. We didn't breathe fresh air. We breathed more like the way fish breathe. In the first trimester, the fetus still has gill sacks, and eventually they become the eustachian tube for balancing pressure on the eardrum. But that's another side trip that I don't want to get into. But as people began to develop the ability to think concretely, at the same time they developed lungs. They developed lungs, and they developed lungs by, instead of being vegetarian as they were in Lemuria and before, they developed lungs by becoming carnivores. This was well after what is biblically called the fall of humanity, and the result of taking in all the protein made possible the building of lungs. And when we had built the lungs, which correspond to the concrete reasoning in the zodiac yet, both the lungs and the lower thinking concrete mind are ruled by Gemini. And as we were able to tie together, this way the two twins are tied together, cause and consequence, so that we could follow logical trains as a consequence of having experienced this coming out from this, coming out from this, we began to develop the consciousness where we could have an indwelling spirit that could control the mind and the desire nature and the energy and the physical body through the mind. Then there could be a connection and we could be indwelling. And the manna that came down from heaven was the same as we were talking about last semester, the Manu. The I am consciousness, it's too bad that this word has to come up as it does now because it's problematic with the women's movement and all of that. But at any rate, some people developed the lungs and developed the senses so that they could, instead of being in the basins of the earth where it was warm and where the mist was thicker, so that they could come up to the highlands, and they migrated some west and some east. Those that migrated to the west became like the Incas and the Toltecs in early Mayans. Aztecs came out of those cultures, and those that went east went back to an area near the Gobi Desert, between the Gobi Desert and the Kamchatka, where the whole new genetic type was built. I don't want to get into a whole, this could be a really long, and this was the original Exodus. This was not the Exodus of Moses, but the Exodus of Moses works perfectly fine. If you take every place where it says Egypt, if you take Egypt out and put Atlantis in, it works really fine. At this time, over these thousands and thousands of years, as the chosen people, and the chosen people are not the modern Jews. The chosen people are the ones that became the genetic seed producers for what are called the post-Atlantean Indo-European civilizations. What are now called the Jews are a half step between the original chosen people and the other Atlanteans because they crossbred in there and got stuck. But I don't want to get into that. That's a big, long side trip that would be much, it's exciting, but it would be much too much. All of the Atlantean peoples were unconsciously clairvoyant. Their consciousness was still turned inward. Their eyes were not really opened. If you read in the Old Testament of the Bible, in brief moments, usually in sexual contact, people's eyes were opened and they could recognize that there was somebody out there. These people needed to be initiated into the material world. And what is now Egypt is where that initiation took place. And it has been over the last few centuries that it is found out that all of the laws of nature, human and general, are built into the Great Pyramid. And this was how the Atlanteans were initiated into the reality of the material world, was by building the Great Pyramid, which is really, in a way, Solomon's Temple, but I don't want to get into that either. I'll say all kinds of provocative things and then run, that I could demonstrate all kinds of interesting things about that, but I don't want to get into that. This is not meant to be that kind of a talk. In fact, we're going way too long for the notes that we have. But at any rate, Egypt was, you might say, a hostel for the people migrating out of Atlantis and going toward the promised land. It was promised because most people didn't have perception to see it yet. It had to be a promise. And as they got initiated into the material world, they could see the realities. The floods of Noah and Moses are successive inundations of the earth, because I think there were 3 inundations. The last one was actually a sinking of the island of Poseidonus in the middle of the Atlantic, which is called the destruction of Atlantis, that took place about 10,000 BC. The others were at the critical point of the earth being reached, so that the fog that surrounded the earth condensed and became the oceans. This is taking place over many millions of years. All right. Atlantis then, being sort of a hostel and a youth hostel for humanity in its youth and initiation place, became a repository for the ancient Atlantean mystery knowledge. And this is why there is so much reverence and why there is so much unbending, because this came from the time when everybody was clairvoyant and they knew these things to be true. And all of the Atlanteans were terribly magical, either for the good or for evil. That's the reason the moon separated in the first place, was because of horrible deeds of magic. And so magic came as easy to them as walking and running does to us, or things that we know in the material world. All right, so that's one of the major sources of Egyptian culture, is the original Atlantean wisdom. Unadulterated, because all of the other things after the great event that took place in Gobi land, let's use that as a shortening of words, and the new people, not the giants, but the new people came out from there and migrated to different parts of the earth, then with the genetic changes that took place, changes of consciousness took place, and that all of the myths and mysteries and outlook of the modern post-Atlantean world didn't seem anything at all like Atlantis. In fact, they probably were accompanied by a shift in the magnetic field, because all of the Atlantean remnants are not vocal languages. They're all pictograms. Chinese still has the flavor of Atlantean things, and for that reason they hang on to them very strongly in the same way that the Egyptians do. And, I'm getting too far afield here. I don't want to lose my focus of concentration. That, they used to write more from right to left and from bottom to top rather than from top down and from left to right. And that probably has something to do with the Coriolis effect, or with the changes of the Coriolis effect of having gone back toward the east rather than continuously going west. You have to go back and tidy up every now and then and dissolve the past and then continue on west again. And that means that this migration produced a difference in consciousness, as well as a change in the magnetic field would cause us to look at things with a different viewpoint. But I don't want to get in. There's so many things that we could go into this that it would just be fun things. And so, all right, so that is one of the sources of Atlantean culture. A second source is purely African. In the early days of anthropology and Egyptology, they were very biblical in nature, and they took Noah and Noah's three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, as being the origin of all of the peoples on the earth. And the African peoples were called Hamitic people, and they had their own culture. And there are things like there are very primitive totem kinds of things that were in Egypt and in Libya and such like that. And those had an influence. In fact, they got, how would you say it? For people who did not have a grand concept of the wonder that we live in and did not have an understanding of the huge hierarchy, but people that were more focused in their clairvoyance on spirits of their soil and of their locality and such like that. They got involved with local spirits and deities and things like that because theirs was a hand-to-mouth kind of existence, and they developed their religion in such a way that they were obedient to the only things that they could see because they did not have the vast visionary kind of consciousness that some of the other seers had. And so those elements are also elements, the purely North African, Libyan, primitive Egyptian factors that are in Egyptian mythology. And there is one last source, and that is Hindu. At a very early time, something like, this is a very early time relative to our thinking, not relative to 250,000 years, but somewhere about 6,000 BC, one of the deepest mystery schools of the Hindus, because it struck out against orthodoxy and all the stupidity of orthodoxy, was thrown out of India. There were several of such emigrations. One is, at a very ancient time, all of the involuntary clairvoyants and mediums, or channelers, if you want to call them that, were thrown out of India, and they became what are now called gypsies. They did not come from Egypt, they came from India. In fact, that's now pretty well accepted. I thought I had a first on that, but now other people are coming to the same outlook. And the Nagas, which was another wise priest cult group from India, came to Arcadia and brought their Arcadian visions with them. But the gymnosophists, who were so well developed that they even had a calculus, and a calculus that was not exactly like Newton's, but it was especially good for astrological calculations. They came to Ethiopia, and from Ethiopia they made their way up into Egypt, and they had a large influence on Egyptian culture and Egyptian mythology. All right, we got the boring stuff out of the way. There are the Romans, as we said before, and the Persians and such like that had an influence also. For the most part, we're going to be dealing with the myths in the dynastic periods, and we're going to be dealing with the periods from probably 20,000 BC to the present. When the form that it was in and those recensions. We're not going to do anything ancient because that's very unreliable. And we're going to limit ourselves not to the total of Egyptian culture, but only to the spiritual part, because we're trying to get at hierarchy and we're not trying to be Egyptologists. So let's do a little very brief look at the metaphysical theology of the Egyptians and relate it and recapitulate everything that we did with the Hindus all over again. The most ancient concept of the Egyptians and the most universal concept for what we would call divinity. Yeah. All right. I'll learn how to spell yet. Is a term that is called netter. You're going to get a lot of Egyptian words tonight, just so that you can. I want to demonstrate some points about the Egyptians, but this is the closest that we can put it in our phonetic language, our guess to what the word was like in Egyptian, because we really don't know for certain. And the concept of netter was very, very elusive. Very elusive. However, it represented the singular thing that everything else was made of. It had the same ineffability and the same lack of definition, and any definition that would be made would sound like a trite tautology. It is almost identical when you read translations, not interpretations, but when you read translations of hieroglyphs from various sources. The concept of netter was almost identical to the concept of Brahm. Not Brahma, but Brahm. Remember when we talked about the supreme ineffable of consciousness, the Hindus called that Brahm. There are multiple subtle, abstruse, variable definitions. If you add a T, that's feminine. And I guess I don't want to go into that, it'd be too far afield. Some of the most basic definitions of the ultimate spirit of consciousness are creation. That is most universal. Especially creation of itself. It creates its own being again and again and again. It's like a love that it's full. Plants, as long as they live, must grow. Animals, being motile, especially if you get things like horses or zebras or something like that, as long as they live, must move. Humans, as long as we continue to be alive in the Spirit, we must think and create new thoughts. That is what we do to stay alive. God, or Spirit, or Netter, or Brahm, loves and births itself perpetually into existence by recreation. And it is so pure, it is so fundamental, it is so essential that it is constantly new. Creation is new. It's not the same thing over and over again. And the more one draws closer to the divine, the more one can look at the same almost simple things, most universal things, and it's new all over again. You almost feel like an idiot, that playing that it's new. Like music is like that. You can play the same piece over again and again, and it's always new. It was also a being of generation, and it generated life not just creative love, but it generated life. And it was an uncentralized source of light. And that light was like the light of the Neoplatonists. It was a light of intelligibility. Not intelligence, but intelligibility, which is intelligence is a product of intelligibility. And it had an essence of divinity. And the closest word in the English language for that essence of divinity would be what we call character. So you see, all religions really are one religion, and all the mysteries and the mystery schools of all religions come to the same conclusions about the ultimate nature of divinity, because everybody experiences the same thing. All right. So, even though they were very materialistic people, and even though they were very magical people, they were capable of very subtle abstraction, extremely subtle abstraction. When they symbolized matter and gave it a picture, it was a picture of an axe. Anything that was divine or anything that had to do with the divine or with spirit had as part of its hieroglyph an axe, which is a pretty beautiful symbol. If it had been a hammer, it would have been only will. But an axe has the momentum like a hammer has, but it also has the wisdom of a knife blade. And it is active. It's a tool. It's a device. So the three basic qualities of will, wisdom, and activity, or utility, utile action, is indicated in the symbol. All right. How long are we going here? It was really interesting the way they expressed abstract things in hieroglyphs. When they got to the ultimate basis of stuff, or the ultimate matter, where spirit and matter unify, this was called the stuff of stuff. The spirit of spirit, or as the Bible calls it, the Father of lights, the light of all lights. And it's the simplest way to get at that principle of that which raises us up. If we aspire to something, we transcend our physical conditions and we see things from a more universal sense. And if we aspire even higher, we transcend more in more realms. If we take this principle and give it to Netter, or to the One transcends itself to itself. So it is the spirit of spirit. So that you don't need all those transcendences of this realm and this realm and this realm. It is sufficient unto itself. A tautological, self-focused or self-originating transcendence. All right. That's a really lovely big topic that I'd like to go into, but I guess there's too many things that I'd like to go into, and I can't never get to them. Another way that they expressed their subtlety is, since they were very material, they did a lot of artwork. And the artwork was very stylized. And it was stylized for magical purposes. And the artwork very clearly shows that it has an Atlantean origin. Because remember those wraparound eyes on the side of the head? That isn't because they were poor drawers. That is because the way people looked when they came out of Atlantis. The forehead was very much sloped, and the face was thin, so that there was the appearance of the eyes being on the side of the head. Some people claim that a lot of the nature spirits which model themselves when there's a conscious interaction between something like a fairy and a human being, when you see it and it picks up from your seeing it, because it doesn't have self-consciousness, it takes on your features. And the last time humanity was generally clairvoyant was in Atlantean times, and a lot of seers claim, who can read back in the memory of nature, say they look at the nature spirits and say they still have a lot of Atlantean characteristics yet. Though I guess Walt Disney has even invaded that world, that by imagination and not by direct perception of the spiritual worlds it has gotten there. So they did a lot of drawings, and in all of their drawings, concepts. Remember we talked about when we talked about Swayambhuva, when we were talking about Hindu mythology, we were talking about the tetrahedron as the principle of Immaculate Conception in all the mystery schools. Well, the Egyptians had all of these magical figures, and these magical figures, in their proportions, had mathematical conceptions built right into them. They have things like of a strange Egyptian mummy leaning back, and it's got a beard and it's got an erection. If you take that erection in its distance from the feet relative to the top of the head, it forms a perfect golden section. They're all so like all of the abstraction. So like the people didn't know that, but the priests did. And when they had the people drawing these magical pictures, because if they drew these magical pictures, they would then have power over those things in the inner worlds, or for them it meant the future life. They were bringing mathematical conceptions into their consciousness without being taught geometry or things like that. It was all right there, and it was all part of the stylistic kind of structure. Also, the principle of the once removed quality, that which ascends itself to itself, that principle is most universal in what we call the principle of analogy, or the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below. What has gone before will follow after on earth. Know this and rejoice. This was something that was throughout all of their culture. And it was throughout all of their culture in a most unique way, but because of the clairvoyance that the Atlanteans had, and because of the magical tendencies, they knew that divine things emanated part of their being into creatures. And the way they had the as above, so below is in what later on Paracelsus, the great alchemist and physician, what he called the doctrine of correspondences. Tangled in my own tail. And that is to say that everything that is on earth has a spiritual counterpart in heaven. This is where the whole idea of herbalism comes from. This is where the whole idea that certain crystals have certain properties and certain animals have certain magical properties, so that if you take a hair of this and put it into a blend with that, it is that everything in the world is ruled by something in the realms of spirit. So below as above. Because they inverted it a lot. They weren't looking at the gods as above, so below. They were looking at by trying the manipulations of matter, they hoped to effect changes in the gods, which is in a way true, but you don't have to do those manipulations. Anytime that we look at nature and get an impression and get a thought or an understanding about the nature of something and understand the beauty of it, because God doesn't have eyes, self-conscious eyes, except through us. And anytime we look at anything with our perceptions and understand it and know it, we're literally feeding the experience of this world, which God cannot get directly, through us. Only they tried to affect God by magical manipulations of matter rather than directly through the perceptions, because that's the way things developed in Atlantis, because perceptions weren't fully developed yet. They didn't have a lot of vision. Oh boy. And so they were quite inverted about it. The culture of the Egyptians was monophilosophical as monotheistic. There was no esoteric and no exoteric. It was all one. Because they just took magic for granted. There weren't any secret things. It's just that some people had more magic than somebody else. And it was all monotheistic, and it was centered on one being. We're going to talk a lot about that because that's really important to hierarchy. Now, oh boy, I got so many notes here. It's unbelievable. I thought, we got enough that we get most of it in before the tape runs out. I'll try to make it as long as the tape and no longer. Ultimately, where the Supreme Being issues from or rests in the unknown absolute, which can only be symbolized by silence or blind darkness, that potential where everything comes from and nothing comes from. At that place, all spirit and matter, all time and space fuse into what physicists would call a cosmic monopole. This is called, in the mysteries by the seers, this is called cosmic root substance. The Egyptians called it the stuff of stuff, and they called it pout. But it was also the spirit of spirit was mixed in there at the same time. So that the soul of souls, the stuff of stuff, was pout and pouty, with the E carried long. Is, I don't know if that's exactly the pronunciation because I don't remember my Egyptian incarnations. It's been a long time. And I've done a lot of forgetting in there. I've gotten myself very much absorbed in worldly matters so that my memory isn't so good anymore. But Pauti represented the other element of the cosmic root substance where spirit and matter both meet. So they recognized the same thing, the ultimate unity. So that when they had a monotheism, it wasn't just a monotheism that says there's one God and you better fall in line after that one God. Theirs was based on seership. They understood that there could be no communion of any kind of experience, of any kind of knowing, self-knowing, or spiritual being if there wasn't one thing that was common to everything. And how did Krishna say it? If there were another greater than me, it were I. That one is one. It's that universal. All right. So they had many, many hierarchies from that place where the soul of souls and the stuff of stuff were one. And it was all analogized to the world in a most mundane way, so that every hour of the day or night, like they had all kinds of gradations of twilight, and they had all kinds of understanding about the darkness of night and the activities of different hours of the day, the entire creation of the cosmos was analogized to and from very mundane earthly conditions, day by day by day. Very, very beautiful. Many of the hierarchies became obscured by monotheism. We're going to get into that later. And they did develop the doctrine of correspondences a lot, and they had a lot of specific things. That's one of the problems with, if you do things by works, you gain control of yourself. And that involves a certain amount of concentration. And concentration has the quality of ignoring everything but the item that you concentrate on. And if one is trying to influence a divinity through a magical act, maybe to have better crops or to get rid of an enemy, because at one time I think there were 72 different schools of magic in Egypt, and most of them were gray or darker. And so that you could get into that many different ways of learning about magic. This is within the last 10,000 years that there were that many schools of magic there. But if you're focusing on one thing, specialization tends to ignore. And it makes for a really strange kind of conception to have, on one hand, a very sublime monotheism and then a fixation on one particular part. But we're going to talk about that relative to hierarchy later on too. But I'm just trying to introduce a number of themes that we're going to be getting into, and we're just about done. Just for the fun of it, I'll give you a whole bunch of terms that we may use, though I'll try to keep away from using them, but just so you can impress your friends and say, yeah, I know something about Egyptian metaphysics, and I know all of these terms. Let's start from the bottom up. Tao was called the double. So what we call the etheric vital body, or what we leave the physical in, was called Tao. How to say it? Sekhim was kind of a universal. It corresponds to what Freud called libido, or what the Hindus call kundalini, or what in the West we call life force or sexual energy. It is the energy that flows through the etheric body that we use in healing, but it has an element of emotion and desire nature in it. And so what you might call it, let's just call it a universal force that is a concentration of all of the realms that are in our experience, was called Sekhim. On the other hand, the ability to change things in the spirit, almost in the Buddhist sense,